Okay, without further ado, welcome to the start of the AGI Heads and Chairs webinar series for this academic year. And I hope everyone has had a good summer as we head into exploring some new areas. So, few introductions. Pranoti Asher, who is Assistant Director of Grants and Education Programs at AGU, and Eva Kostiu, who's Program Manager of the AGU Bridge Program. Unfortunately, neither of them are able to join us today. Pranoti's at the NABG conference, and unfortunately, that hotel, I guess, has sort of sketchy Wi-Fi. I'm Christopher Keane. I'm the Director of Geoscience Profession Higher Ed at AGI, and Leila Gonzales, also with me here at AGI, is online as well. Today we're looking at skills for the future geoscience employment and careers. As I mentioned, it's myself and Leila Gonzales. We're going to be tag teaming this presentation, looking at a whole bunch of new developments. There's a lot going on, within the evolution that we're seeing in both the employment and the career space. We've gotten a lot of good new intelligence from the International Geologic Congress that we just returned from, as well as the recent BLS data report from late last week is, I'll say, somewhat revolutionary. And if you've been looking at the business news, a lot of folks are certainly pointing out to new developments there. So the actual presentation, what I really want to do is sort of start this off as a journey to look at the accelerating changes that we're seeing for the geoscience enterprise, and especially how these externalities are actually driving what the reality of geoscience work is now and into the future. I think this is one of those key components, and every industry, every field is looking at this. We're not necessarily masters of our own destiny and how things are going to function, but we certainly are in position to help influence and be able to ensure our disciplines engage in the future economy robustly. So the first thing I want to do is give a real fresh look at enrollments and degrees. So literally just finished the analysis earlier this week with the 2003 enrollments. Couple things here. The big one is that 2002 bump was, as I suspected, was a dead cat bounce in enrollments, largely from students that had stepped away from their studies during the pandemic and had come back. We see that also reflected in the degrees granted. So, certainly most people are feeling negative pressures on their enrollment, and certainly that's what we are seeing. The good news is that the graduate enrollments are starting to recover. That is something that we're very hopeful for. But as we'll see from the degrees granted, there is some different dynamic. To answer your question, this data is from what we collect as part of the Directorate of Geoscience departments. So the degrees awarded, as usual, the bachelor's is a sort of a muted form of the enrollments. We do see sort of that surge of degrees, folks exiting back out. So we are sort of hitting the point that we thought is somewhere around 2024 we would start pushing out the last of the real pandemic impacts in enrollment. But I think what's really fascinating is looking at this crossover we have going on with the master's versus the PhDs. The fact that we now have substantially more doctorates being granted than masters. This is a big systematic change for us, particularly after we went for so long, better part of 10 years, with masters at a much more elevated level. The last time we saw a crossover was a point of great transition for the geosciences. I think we can argue the entire economy is in a great transition, and some of that is shaping out. And I think, as you will see in some of the data that Leila is going to be talking about, sort of the stratification of where employment is changing relative to what we would slice into traditional educational levels. So this is definitely very interesting and something that we'll be keeping an eye out for. I do think, from talking with folks in companies, the long adage that the master's is the degree of employment in the geosciences has definitely been weakening as there are increasing needs at the lower levels of experience and also at the upper levels. So some general observations as we get in. I'm going to sort of try to tackle this at a 30,000 foot level. Leila's going to come in with a lot of data of things that we're seeing. But this in particular from, the conversations we had at the IGC over the last couple of weeks, if we look at the world in general, enrollments are down in the geosciences everywhere. This isn't a uniquely US situation. And mostly what I was hearing from folks was social disfavor towards the geosciences, largely viewed as negatively impacting the quality of life, mining, oil and gas, those kinds of issues, and unclarity, lack of clarity in how we benefit society, but also demographics. The United States isn't the only place facing an enrollment cliff. That's an almost global phenomenon at this point. So where everyone's having to make readjustments. What I do find interesting is in general, aggregate employment demand for geoscientists is up. The biggest challenge is there still seems to be this gap on matching the skills. So the skills being the functional way for folks to deliver the knowledge that they have. And this didn't seem to matter what continent folks were on. This is an ongoing challenge. We'll talk about some creative approaches folks are starting to work with to try to address that. The other thing that this absolutely shocked me, we've been seeing the trend where employment in geosciences is increasingly moving into the professional services sector, away from things like the oil and gas companies and the mining companies and major engineering firms and things like that, but rather into the consultant services space, where people are actually now doing a much more diverse set of work. And I assume that was a sort of a uniquely maybe North American perspective, but we are seeing that as a global trend. So that is very interesting. Also means we need to be rethinking our social position, because that puts us more like physicians and lawyers and folks like that are bringing that individual expertise into the marketplace. There were a few curious observations. Had some long discussions with folks at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And in the last 2 years, they've seen a greater than 30% decline in their geoscience enrollments. I know a lot of people, have all kinds of projections about what's happening in China, but their departments are facing closures. The song I'm hearing out of China is exactly what I hear from so many folks here. They also have a real big problem that they have mass unemployment in new geoscientists. So there's this disruption. A lot of it is being driven by the fact that China readjusted how people are assigned to their college majors. So they have actually, they're seeing a very poor matching of aptitude and interest to occupations. And so this has created a lot of disruption. But if you've been reading the international news, all college graduates in China have been facing serious employment problems. And likewise, what was interesting is Chinese geoscience departments, they're surviving on foreign graduate student revenue. The thing that was really striking at the conference were the number of graduate students from Chinese universities from third countries, and not just developing nations, but even from European institutions and things like that. And my colleagues at the Academy basically confirmed that this is an absolutely critical revenue source, for keeping a lot of these departments solvent. Overall, I actually would argue, talking with folks from around the world, our situation looks pretty healthy. We're managing it pretty well. I know a lot of departments are struggling. We have a whole bunch of departments that are really thriving. And in general, we have mismatches in employment and graduates, but it's addressable. And there are a lot of people doing some creative work that way. And I think that's the fun part, is we are seeing creative approaches. But we are facing storms. We've talked about it previously, about things like the demographic challenge. That's not going away. The younger populations are not coming, and then we obviously are struggling against this public view of higher education, as far as that return on investment and all the other dynamic issues, social issues that whether you agree with it or not, is in the public discourse, and that's a negative drag on the traditional pathways, which then also brings up this whole issue that we're now starting to see alternative pathways things like industry-driven apprenticeship programs, things like that, that are starting to pop up. I'll talk about that in a little more detail. So from the standpoint of geoscience departments, there's all kinds of disruption on the horizon. But there are roadmaps to agility. I'll point out vision and change. There've been plenty of talks, folks, out of NAGT and CERC and other groups. I have a lot of confidence geoscience programs can adapt to all these changes. The biggest issue that we all face is the social engineering challenges, whether it's with the faculty, with your administrators, or even with the students. Because I think the biggest thing that I'm really boiling down to, the biggest complaint I'm hearing from the employers, for instance, is maturity of graduates. They just don't bring the professionalism and maturity that is needed to succeed in the workplace. And unfortunately, just as my wife, who teaches in secondary school, complains that she has to be the parent and social worker for so many of her students, the concern is, the faculty probably, and I know many of you already do, but this is going to become part of a role to actually prepare a lot of these students, not just intellectually, but also emotionally and socially, for their next steps in life. And I think one of the things, like if I look at vision and change and so many of the other efforts that we've done, we haven't really been itemizing narrow actions, but it's about fostering these bigger pictures and agility. And I think that's the key to success, and we'll see sort of how that plays out. Because I think one of the big issues is that we are seeing this rapid change in the nature of geoscience work. And Leila has incredible data from BLS. AI is impacting geoscience employment. It's actually impacting employment across every sector of the economy. But one of our other bigger challenges, and this is sort of in this gap of demand and supply, if we are failing to meet the FTE demands of the workplace, then innovation is going to actually take over that economic activity. In essence, it's going to reduce the actual need for FTEs. Realities, I'll admit, at AGI, in our program, we have actually reduced, functionally, we've replaced 2 FTEs through the use of open source AI models. We had individuals who left and moved on to other opportunities, and we were actually able to replace probably about 80% of their work using open source models. And that's exactly the kind of response that you're seeing out of companies. You're seeing this most in this transition, most organizations that are growing and capitalized. And that's where I get a lot of folks who are saying, well, company X, really, they seem to be doing it the old way. And that's fine, but in a lot of cases, they're not very capitalized. Where we're seeing a lot of it are the folks that are publicly traded companies that maybe have a lot of money or are making big investments in spaces or have venture capital, and they're growing. FTE is full-time equivalent, so basically a worker, to clarify that. The big impacts that we're seeing is in the middle skill space, so the entry level technical skills and those bigger cognitive skills still really seem to be very much in demand, is where it's builds these tools. And as I mentioned, the employer concern is the graduate's ability to do anything. They know the material, but can they translate that into action? And part of that's that whole sort of maturity perspective. And that sort of leads to that other point I like to always point out, is that 92% of the geoscience positions in this country are in the application space. They are not in the basic research area. And so getting that mind transition is going to be one of those keys. And I think this is the exciting thing. I think this is where so many of the departments have come so far. The jobs today are really not very siloed like they were, perhaps when most of us were going through school, because as they moved into the professional services field, they're working across, the problems they work across can be across energy, can be across minerals, environmental, compliance, you name it. And so it really is about educating for that big G, geoscience. And so there's this disconnect, and it's not a matter of throwing up our hands. We're starting to see some really bright and innovative ideas. We've got some things that we've proposed, but these are 2 that are actually got traction. One is a number of the engineering companies have started to do actually direct high school to industry apprenticeships in geoscience. And they're recruiting new high school graduates, maybe first year community college students, and they're focusing on evaluating their work ethic, their energy, their potential, their interest in working in this case, the engineering environmental space, and they're training them up in apprenticeships for geotech positions. And they're focused on just-in-time geoscience knowledge introduction. And so what they're doing is they're developing good workers who are very much embedded, building a career in our discipline. And one of the key things that they're hanging out there, not even so much as a carrot, but as part of their strategy, is basically they're thinking after 2 years, when these students, when these apprentices have demonstrated the potential and the aptitude, then the education support processes, the tuition reimbursements and things of the companies, they want to support them to go through, get their college degree in geology, in engineering, whatever is most appropriate for the students. And I think that's potentially a huge opportunity space for the geoscience departments, is to start looking at how, in essence, these companies may be, in the end, bringing a lot of really high caliber students to the door. So it'll be interesting to watch how this evolves. The other was, something that we saw at the IGC. So in Brazil, they're moving towards what they're basically modeling after the medical industry, having a residency model. Their sort of internal blunt evaluation of within the Brazilian universities is the curriculum is pretty poor at developing the skills and applications. It's just the nature of the system, the nature of how the education is conveyed, and so rather than trying to change the universities and recognizing the university very good at that knowledge and problem solving capacity, and taking those students who have that, and then they employed these graduates for 2 years in this residency program, mostly through the Geological Survey. And part of the intent is during that 2 years, now they're getting paid pretty base wages, enough to have a crash pad, but it's still, they're employed. They get to move around the organization, learn skills and problem areas across a wide range of areas in the geosciences and around the country. And what's interesting is they had teamed up with a number of the universities so that these students that are coming out of this residency program for 2 years, they have to sort of demonstrate some output products, and they will obviously have a strong skill portfolio, but they're actually awarded a master's degree upon completion. So they're finding that this is an interesting model again to help bridge and launch the students in. Because in Brazil, as they said, they're seeing this incredible diverse change in what the geologic problems are that they're dealing with, everything from deforestation, sediment impacts, to water availability, to mineral resources, and so on. And of course, the other thing, and we'll see a lot of this in the data, AI is obviously on the topic of a lot of people's discussions on workforce. It is replacing people. The data is out there now. And when we talk with folks in industry, in the geosciences, what the real focus is automating out the dirty, the dangerous, and the repetitive. And we see this if you go to PDAC, which is the big mining conference every March in Canada, with all the global players, you're seeing a rapid move towards remote mine operations, fully automated, remotely controlled. There are a number that are up in the Pilbara where the workers, the geologists, and the engineers are all sitting in Melbourne. They have go teams to go fix the machines, but otherwise it is pretty much remote. Likewise, pandemic demonstrated exactly how much field on the ground time was needed for, like, in mineral exploration. And so in a lot of their cases, mineral exploration is largely remote. And in some of these cases, they're only seeing their explorationists out in the field 2, 3, 4 days of the year, answering very specific questions. And that's, I think, the key thing is all that automation is getting is empowering the geoscientists to focus on the hardest geoscience questions. And so, like, one of the exploration companies pointed out is they still haven't figured out, with all the other sensors and drones and everything like that, the kinematics of the geology. And that's where the boots need to hit the ground, and they go in with the questions and try to address it. And of course, we've had all this automation of core, log, and seismic interpretation. So again, it's a lot of that middle skill stuff is going out, but with the intention that, the geoscience enterprise wants geoscientists to do geoscience and not just plug and chug stuff. But when we talk about AI, I think one of the concerns I have is there's a lot of hype, and both Leila and I have been up to our eyeballs in a lot of AI applications over the last 9 to 12 months, and it is everywhere. But I think you look at the concept of the 7 levels of AI, and it's everywhere. It's in your coffee maker. Just even the whole idea that you have a timer that triggers, on the clock and starts making your coffee in the morning, all the way up to some of these interesting military applications that you're seeing, with drones and a semi-autonomous decision making and the like. But when you look at the sort of the state of the art, where the public discourse is, we're pretty much at what is considered level 4. These large language models, these are stochastic engines. All they know how to do is predict the next set of letters. But the reality is, language is a really good way to encapsulate human knowledge, and especially human logic. And that's why this stuff looks magical, but is certainly prone to some problems. But when you take, if you look through the history of AI and you start applying tools on top of each level, your functional practice starts to move up additional levels. So if you look at where the state of the art today is with the use of large language models, it isn't about building a better model. That's an academic exercise. It's actually on the tool building that's moving the function and application up into the levels 5 and 6. And so this sort of comes, the Gartner curve for the tech life cycle phase, sort of the observation as I, take a lay of the land talking to colleagues here. It seems like a lot of folks are somewhere between the peak of inflated expectations and the trough of disillusionment on AI. How many times have we heard, I used ChatGPT a couple times, it wasn't very good, it got it wrong or whatever. Well, that's actually not how it was ever meant to work. It was never Google. It's actually, these things are actually logic engines. And if you get into the open source models, you really start to see how they are all fine tuned that way. But the reality is, as you move over into industry, and in fact, there was a couple of the articles that came out today based on the BLS data that Leila is going to be presenting. They were talking about 40% of companies are actually using AI in their systems and aren't actually disclosing it to anyone, because they have moved into this plateau of productivity, as they call it. And it's because if you use the tools right, not as super Google, but as a tool, it'll give you the 80% solution fast. And when you couple it with other techniques, things like RAG, knowledge graphs, and especially now that where the state of the art's moving is to agents, these are things that are accelerating productivity. Doesn't necessarily throw the person out, but makes the people, it helps bring the value of the work people are doing to a higher level. They're getting rid of a lot of the plug and chug. And I get concerned because, just like being at IGC, I'm deathly curious to see at GSA and AGU coming up. In Geo, I'm seeing a lot of presentations where they're talking about the use of AI, and then, to be honest with you, it's being spun as sexiness. And and if you're building models, people seem to be missing the point. You have to spend as much time creating your negation data as you are your training data, and all those other kinds of methodologies, where it seems, I'm curious to see if what we see in particularly GSA and AGU is a lot more folks that are out in that tool building space and moving us out into that plateau of productivity. But that's what's driving the employment impacts and the skills impacts of AI, is the fact that it's the coupling and turning into a tool. The other side is, the sort of these other underlying cultural changes that are starting to emerge, which is really fascinating. So obviously AI is this one driver, but it's interesting. So we're at the National Conference of State Legislators. Great opportunity to meet current and and future Congress people and state legislators, their staff. It's the only real open policy event that occurs in this country. And what was most striking this year is the issue of climate change as some kind of debate is done. Even the most conservative guys from the coal areas of Wyoming, it isn't whether climate's changing or not. That they're past that. You know, the national debate has a lot of postures. The reality is the folks that are trying to make decisions have moved past it. And the reality is it's the insurance industry that demonstrated it. As you mostly all know, you know, with things that are happening in California and Florida, you know, like with homeowners insurance, you know, because of the hazards, but it's happening in other areas, things like crop insurance and the like. And these folks are concerned that the government's going to be holding the bag. So the insurance company has pretty much been able to demonstrate to them climate change is real, and we're starting to actually get impacted. But what the difference is what the policymakers, what the companies are looking for. They don't need to be told climate is changing and by how much. What they need to do is know how to start implementing solutions to address the impacts. And I think this is one of those key changes that as a community we need to look at. And that's one of the things that, you know, where the employment growth is. As an example, the Defense Department has about $700 million sitting, waiting for state agencies to take to use, as they said, natural solutions to improve climate resilience of domestic military bases. And they're having a hard time anyone bothering to come take it. This, you know, the geological surveys and the universities, it should be out there. This is our space. You know, they don't want just an engineering solution, but how do we actually look at it in a bigger way? You know, so we have all these interesting changes that are sort of, you know, our flavors are changing. You know, we've sort of moved on from chocolate chip onto Oreo ice cream kind of thing. And so that is sort of, it's forcing departments in through this crucible. And I know, I mean, talk with many of you, these ongoing transformations, so many departments have made huge transformations over the last 5 to 10 years. It is exhausting, and disruption is a hard space, but I think we really are in a space probably as fundamental in the economy as something like the, you know, to the changes that the U.S. economy at least has to deal with, as fundamental as the industrial revolution, information revolution. But we have opportunities. There are a lot of opportunities. There's risks, but if we find the right places, and Bureau of Labor Statistics seems to be thinking that we do have that opportunity, and hopefully we can make that alignment. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Leila, and she can talk about a lot of the underlying data.
Thanks, Chris. So what I'm going to have us do now is take a look at some of the data that Bureau of Labor Statistics just released at the end of last month, so just last Friday. So we can take a look at where the future is heading for geoscience occupations over the coming decade, as well as kind of more broadly. So what we're seeing here on this chart is U.S. occupations across the board are projected to really see an increase of about 4% of employment over the next decade. Now, this is up from last year's release of their projections data, which expected a 2.8% increase. So the outlook has definitely improved, and that's good to see. But we're seeing also here within the geoscience occupations overall, we're expecting to see an increase of about 5.6% increase over the next decade. Again, that's up from last year's projections of 4.4%. So we are seeing another great thing that we're seeing here in the projections is that we're seeing growth across all geoscience occupations, with most of those occupations exceeding that 4% baseline of growth. And we're also going to delve into here going forward some of the factors that are affecting that employment projection outlook. And those would be things like substitutions, productivity changes, and demand changes that are BLS is saying that can cause increase or decreases in their projection outlooks. And so relative to the geoscience occupations that we're looking at here on this chart, where we're seeing that decreased growth relative to that 4% baseline, so really in the geoscience technician jobs as well as hydrologists, we're seeing that decrease in growth primarily due to AI and automation that is replacing jobs through substitution. That's going to be decreasing demand for services provided by those occupations, but also increasing productivity, which in turn reduces the need for workers. We also see that society's response to climate change impacts is really factoring into the increased demand here that we see for conservation scientists as well as environmental scientists going forward. So we're also seeing other occupations that we're looking at here on this chart, some of the major occupations that are being in fact impacted by these factors. We're going to take a look at that a little bit more on the next chart, but specifically here, computer science and math occupations are really seeing an increase in jobs related to applications spaces for AI and automation. We also see engineering similarly affected by AI and automation changes that is driving increases in those occupations, specifically looking at engineering application spaces for integration of AI into software, into robots, into remote operations, like some of the stuff that Chris talked about earlier. Also, we do see some climate change factors increasing demand within engineering job space due to policies and regulations related to things such as environmental protection and sustainability. So that's good to see. Within the more broad life, physical, and social science occupationals categories, we do see the increase in AI and automation and increasing jobs related to disease detection and understanding. So that's going to be more in the biological sciences space. Also for use in forensic science for criminal investigation. And then we also see climate change factors increasing jobs as employers are starting to prioritize worker health and safety. And in that is mentioned the greater prevalence of climate hazards. So just to note here that specifically this is focused around occupational health and safety occupations. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at kind of the broader landscape of how AI and automation that BLS is expecting a lot of changes in the coming decade to the employment landscape. So the point here is that these impacts are not just specific to geoscience. We're seeing wide-ranging impacts across all occupations, and mostly it's impacting the middle and low-skilled jobs that we're seeing the job losses as a result of this automation and AI integration. So what we're seeing in the chart here on the right is the percentage of occupations within each occupational category that are experiencing changes. So losses as denoted by the red bars or gains as denoted by the blue bars. And so if we look over here to the left of the chart, if we look at all occupations, we see that about a quarter of occupations are expected to see job losses in the coming decade due to integration of AI technologies and automation of processes, where only 5% are expected to see gains. And those gains are really focused predominantly within computer science and math occupations, again, like we talked about on the previous slide, as well as within the business and finance occupational landscape there. Now, going back to the Gartner hype diagram that Chris showed earlier, what we're seeing within the computer and math and business and finance occupational categories is that it appears that these occupations have really hit that plateau of productivity, where they're focused on the application spaces of how do you integrate AI technologies into and automate work processes, whereas a lot of the other occupational categories are really in those earlier stages of adoption of these technologies. So if we take a step back and we take a look at this chart more broadly, I just want to mention that we're looking at about 30% of jobs across the board that are going to be affected by AI and automation in the coming decade. And that's if you combine, the losses and the percentage of jobs that are expecting losses and the percentage of jobs that are expecting gains. And one thing we'll look at going forward here is that only about 4% of occupations are projected to be impacted by society's response to climate change. So effectively, what I'm trying to make the point here is that AI and automation is the current wave of transformation that is sweeping through that occupational landscape that we're seeing. But it looks like on the horizon behind that, the next wave of transformation that is coming is going to be focused on climate change, adaptation, sustainability. And that's going to be coming after we see this current wave go through. So I'm going to switch over to some new data we just released this week. We're going to be focused on a rapid response survey that's part of our ongoing Grande project, which is an NSF-funded study to examine how the geosciences are leveraging natural disasters for enhanced educational and research opportunities. And this survey is part of that broader study, and it's designed to basically capture participants' immediate thoughts and reactions regarding the current state and future of the geosciences, and where the geosciences are going to be headed over the next decade. And so what we did is we asked participants to provide us with short, open responses to prompts that were focused on trends in higher education, career pathways, perspectives on the geoscience discipline as a whole, changes in research activities, as well as the relevance of geosciences to societal issues. And this was, as we said, rapid response. Participants were only given about 30 seconds to provide up to 5 short open responses to a prompt. So it really captured that immediate top of mind thought processes that of participants. And so then we took all of those responses, categorized them. And so what we're seeing here is the results displayed as a percentage of responses per cohort in each category. So I just wanted to set the stage. So as we go forward and look at these charts, you kind of have a reference point for what we're looking at. So specifically, we did ask about how participants view the impact of artificial intelligence on earth science research. And what we saw pretty much across all cohorts was concerns about the technology, with most of the responses being pretty emotionally charged. But what we also see is that the mid-career cohorts are recognizing the potential impacts and influence that AI is going to have on research applications. There's a lot of comments there noting about the high potential AI will have for accelerating research and expanding the impact of research in general. We also see among the mid to late career participants, comments related to efficiencies AI provides in terms of automation of tasks, speeding progress, and also increasing discovery. And then some of the early to mid-career cohorts also mentioned using AI specifically for problems related to modeling, pattern recognition, problem solving, visualizing data. So what I want to pause here and emphasize is that one of the things that is a takeaway, I think, from this chart is that we see here this mid-career cohorts who are really realizing the importance, influence, and application-based potentials for these technologies. And at the same time, what we're seeing is a lot of concerns expressed by some of the earlier cohorts about AI technologies and integration of that. And I think in part, in some of the data that we've looked at is because we're seeing that as we have current graduates, early career cohorts may not have this skill set and are not prepared in this regard to for those future opportunities where these skills are going to be critical for problem solving, especially as we move forward into solving a lot of the harder problems ahead of us. So this segues into another question that we asked about. Oh, let me go back and just looking at early, mid, and late career cohorts, just to clarify on that. So early career would be 0 to 4 years post-degree. So that would include students and people that are up to 4 years post-terminal degree. Early to mid-career would be about 4 to 10 years out. Mid to late would be about 10 to 15 years out. And then late career would be 15 years out and beyond, just to clarify that. So another question we also looked at was the importance for what are the important topics for earth science research. And really what we're seeing here is a focus on climate topics. But the responses here were pretty generalized about, kind of circling around climate adaptation, climate resiliency, with a few focused on specific items such as ocean acidification, sea level rise. When we get into the hazards, the comments that were kind of grouped into that hazards category, those were a lot more tangible, focused on specific types of hazards such as floods, earthquakes, slides, volcanoes. But other topics that came up was the emphasis on needing to connect the geosciences with society and, through building trust with communities, through co-production of knowledge, through equitable resource allocation. So there's really this focus on climate-related impacts, hazards, water. Those comments were pretty focused around water security and water management. So we see a really focus here on societal relevance and solving society's problems, as well as related to impacts from climate change. So what skills do geoscientists need, and when and where are those skills acquired? So we're going to take a look at a couple of slides on that. Here in this slide, we're looking at responses related to how participants view additional courses outside of the earth science academic departments that are important for students to take. And, we've seen this before in Vision and Change report and through the years that there's really this emphasis on the need for math skills, specifically calculus and statistics. And we see that echoed here in the responses. Also noted were courses in social sciences, specifically along the lines of GIS, ethics, logic, economics, policy, and political science. And so then when we asked about what about continuing education courses that are important, what we see here is the need for programming, technical, and math skills. And specifically what was called out was AI, machine learning, programming, data analysis, and statistics. But it's very interesting that in the previous slide, we don't see as big of emphasis on the inclusion of those type of skills, specifically around programming and artificial intelligence and machine learning applications. What we also see in science and engineering as recommended for additional courses that earth scientists need for their work. And I realize that there's a lot of data here that we're going to be going through, and I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. We will be posting these slides along with the recording, so you can go back and review this as well. So some other things that were brought up was the importance for communication, lab, and field skills, and also, again, tying back into that policy and law space for continuing education that were identified by participants. So another thing that we also wanted to understand was what were the factors that participants identified as successful for careers, and really 3 topics showed up here. One was personal attributes. Things such as adaptability, flexibility, focus, curiosity, thinking outside the box. Again, a lot of those core attributes that make for really great scientists and problem solving. Also professional development and networking skills, that really, those comments really focused on communication and collaboration. And then technical skills, again, going back to those things that we've seen in the previous slides: analysis, critical thinking, math, programming, writing, spatial thinking. So these were pretty universal across cohorts and factors that are needed for successful careers. And I could say that you would need those pretty much across any career with those type of attributes and skills. So where does the community see the discipline headed over the coming decade? And so here again, we see a real focus on topics related to climate change impacts, sustainability, transition to the renewable energy sources, and also comments related to the management of mineral resources. So that's where the focus that the community has going forward in the future. And sectors where participants identified that earth science skills are going to be needed, we see a lot of the responses kind of focused in on those traditional sectors where geoscientists are currently employed, namely looking at energy sector, government agencies. But we also see comments here related to mitigation, resilience, hazards, and other climate-related factors. And I think that that would be more ubiquitous across employment sectors as well. So what I want to do here is circle back, now that we've looked at kind of where that focus is for the community, circling back to the BLS employment and projections data, again, noting that employment is really expected, looking at some of the changes in employment that BLS is expecting as a result of factors related to sustainability and climate adaptation. Right now, in the current projections that they just released, we see only 4% of all occupations being impact or looking at changes in 4% of all occupations as it relates to sustainability and climate change adaptation. Most of those occupations are being impacted positively. And we're seeing job growth really here related to transition to renewable and electrified energy sources, responses to sustainability related regulations, and responses to climate related hazard mitigation and preparedness. So those are the factors that are really driving the increases in these job occupational categories. So the community, the geosciences community, focus really on prioritizing research related to climate impacts and on connecting research to communities is really in alignment with what we're seeing on the horizon, with factors that are going to be affecting employment and growth for the future. So I know that was a lot of data. And again, like I said, we will be posting this online and we'll give you some links to where you can kind of dig into some of that data more broadly. But I want to just tie all of this together that Chris has talked about and a lot of the data that I've shared here to wrap up with a few things for consideration. First off, we're definitely in a transformational period for employment that is being very strongly driven by AI and automation. The opportunities for leveraging these technologies is huge, as they're needed for solving a lot of those really complex and multifaceted problems, such as climate-related impacts. We have the opportunity here to use AI technologies to build skills in a sequential way to help learners advance in applying these tools and skills to real-life situations and problems, and thereby building those competencies, allowing new questions to be asked, and overall advancing the geoscience research enterprise. So I think we've got a lot of potential here, again, as we saw with some of the comments from the survey, for expanding geoscience research now and into the future. Now, currently, the feedback that we are getting is that AI is something that's important for continuing education. But based on what we're seeing in the employment data and how other occupations are applying AI for problem identification and problem solving, I would suggest that maybe we think about AI as something that really should be introduced during the degree program rather than post-graduation, so that we are equipping our students better for future geoscience careers and some of the future problems that we're going to be dealing with across the board. Now, we see in the employment projections data that societal response to climate change impacts is going to be a factor that's going to be driving increases in employment in the future. And we see the feedback from our community that shows really good alignment with these factors in terms of the importance of research on solving issues related to climate change, linking geosciences into society and solving those social issues related to those type of impacts. So, you know, that's a good thing that we've got that alignment and that focus, because that's, again, that second wave that's going to be coming down the line after we see this sweeping change that AI and automation is going to make across the employment landscape. And so with all of this in mind, some questions I'd like to leave you with is, you know, how are we preparing future geoscientists? Are they going to have the needed skills and agility to adapt to the career landscape that's ahead? Are they going to be agile enough to transfer their skills and knowledge across sectors and occupation? And will they have those personal attributes and soft skills needed for being resilient in the job market? And then what opportunity spaces are we currently providing for students and new graduates that really facilitate their growth as individuals and as future professionals? And so with that, I'd like to really thank you for taking the time to listen to our talks today. I think we can open the floor for questions, and I'll drop these links in the chat. So if you want to dig into the employment projections data some more, or if you want to dig into those charts and more charts, I'll drop those in the chat for you. So thank you, everyone.
So we're happy to entertain questions for a few minutes. While folks think about their questions, I just want to pass along from Pranoti. Just a note that there are 20 seats left in the Heads and Chairs workshop coming up at the December AGU here in Washington, D.C. So, you know, she's encouraging folks that are able to attend. It'll be on that Sunday. It's all day, I think 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. In December. To please make sure you sign up and you know, full day of discussions and workshops. So yeah, be happy to open up the floor for questions. I know there's a lot in the chat, but if you want to raise your hand, we can also unmute you.
And I think, Rodolfo, you have got a question. Let me go ahead and enable your mic so you can unmute and ask your question.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. My question has to do with the professional geology exam. A lot of our students who graduate, I'm here in Miami at Florida International University, and when they go into consulting, employers really do focus, not entirely, A lot of them do agree with your assessment about, personal skills and being able to work in teams and stuff like that as being important. But the PG is something they really do want. And that requires a lot of the old, I guess what we were considered like when I went to school, a lot of the more foundational courses in petrology and structural geology and all those things. And as we change and try to service these needs, we have faculty who are retiring, and maybe we won't get the funding to get somebody who specializes in something like that because climate science again is generating funding and stuff. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on, as we move forward and maybe have to replace faculty and these challenges with getting these traditional courses on the books, if you've heard anything about maybe other universities and things who've had similar situations.
So I mean, I think one of the approaches folks have done is to break the consideration of the course structure and look at the learning outcomes that you're trying to get, because you're dead right. The licensing exams, I mean, and even in all these scenarios, they're still expecting core knowledge, and I think that's sort of one of the things that the Brazilian model I thought was interesting. And they're like, you got to have the core knowledge, particularly to work at that sort of higher intellectual level as a geoscientist. That's where people want to be working. So I think one of the approaches or what have you is to look at your curriculum in its entirety, and to look at how those topics can be sliced in, maybe not necessarily in some of those stovepipes that are very, very hard to bring in. I think one of the key differences, though, and this is where I'm concerned that I'll say the academic rhetoric and the research funders are a bit behind the curve, is the thing that we heard at NCSL. It is about climate impact mitigation, where actually a lot of these fundamental geologic skills are really important, and understanding all those dynamics. And I think we as a community have to make sure that we're demonstrating that utility. Moving forward, it isn't just climate scientists, but it's big G geoscience has a lot to say, particularly on, I'll say the realities today, more than just what those bigger model factors or CCUS or whatever you're looking at. There's going to be there's a lot of demand on this more local scale, I'd say. So I wish I had a better specific. I mean, I think when UVA went through some of their changes in their curriculum and got their students really well aligned for the licensure exams and stuff, a lot of it was sort of looking about what is it we have to teach across the curriculum, and not necessarily worrying about the specific on the FTs.
And also Doug just posted in the chat the ASBOG Task Analysis Survey 2023 results are posted at asbog.org and show where the current workforce sees the demand on the practice. So I'd say take a look at the chat too for that more information. So thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And Tony, I think you've got a question. Let me go ahead and enable your mic so you can unmute.
Thanks. We're an end user of the graduates coming out of the academic programs to the tune of, 400 of them. And I can tell you from one standpoint, those graduates that come out that have a great understanding of the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and that kind of thing aren't really top candidates for us. And that those that have the emphasis on sustainability and bunny quotes, the big picture stuff, that's not what we need, as a hirer of these graduates. We're looking for people who are quantitative, who have skills in GIS, Python, R, that kind of thing, can do some data analysis, that kind of thing. But we also need people that can go into the field and collect the data. We are a strong believer that while I might be great at Python and doing data science analysis and data mining activities for that, that's good, that's helpful. But if you don't understand what the data are that you are working with that severely limits your understanding of the systems that we're trying to characterize in the field. So I caution us to say, oh, we want people that are what I interpreted from this was mostly AI people that know a little bit about geology or geosciences in general. That's right now, I don't think that's in the short term, maybe 20 years from now, it'll be different. But right now, that's what the consulting side of the business is looking for, is those people who can be applied, but they've got some quantifiable or quantification skills at maybe a little higher level than what we would have expected from graduates a decade ago, let's say. So it's getting harder and harder to find the mix of people who want to still go to the field and do the hands-on geology, collecting water levels, looking at drill cuttings and all those things to get the basic information that we need to solve a problem, versus those who wish to be office-based and focus on their computer skills. So anyway, that's just a perspective of someone who been in the industry for a few decades and is actively looking for the right applicants right now.
So Tony, yeah, I think that is exactly the point we're trying to make, is that AI is replacing a lot of the intermediate stuff. It's not that we need AI people, we need good geologists. And that's, I mean, when I talk to people like in the mining industry especially, they need folks, the AI can take care of a lot of the rudimentary, sort of basic. It's when it fails is actually when there's something interesting. And they need people to answer the harder questions. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about too. And so we need to find that balance. But we need to also look at it as a tool, not something to be feared, but rather as a tool to build up into. So I really appreciate your comments, because I think they're very salient.
Yeah, and I think they actually reinforce some of the stuff we're seeing out of BLS too, and some of the comments and some of the results were the specific application spaces were really on, like you said, geoscience with the application and the additional skill sets of quantitative with that to solve specific problems, as opposed to something that's rather vague out there. So thanks for the examples. That's great.
You're welcome.
And Eric, I'm going to go ahead and enable your mics so you can ask your question.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Someone else, other people were asking it in the chat as well. For the past 20 years, there's been the influx of professional master's programs in the U.S. and abroad, a non-thesis, so not a research one, but taking course-based. How has that impacted the training from the universities as well as what the employers think?
So in the grad level phase for Vision and Change, we did take a look at particularly that non-thesis versus thesis option. And, in general, what we saw was accelerated placement in the private sector from the non-thesis. I mean, it basically program alignment delivered what its expectations were. To be honest with you, with all the changes that are sort of going on, and I'll say the tempo, we have not really taken a look at how those non-thesis programs are evolving. To be honest with you, and I think it is something that we, that we at AGI, and I think the community needs to look at and see how it's going. But certainly in the past, that has been they have been fairly effective at that placement process. They ended up having much higher rates of things like internships, employment on graduation, and all those kinds of dynamics. Obviously, the thesis base, particularly the ones that were heading on to PhDs or otherwise, there was more of a traditional lag for their next step. But It's a good question. I don't know what the context is today. That's sort of the observation from about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic. And I don't know if Tony has, from his perspective, with his company, if they have experience on that.
Well, from the perspective of pre-pandemic to post-pandemic,
well, as far as are you recruiting or engaging with non-thesis master's students in your hires? And do you see a difference in that outcomes?
rarely do we get those applicants. Almost all of them are thesis based.
Well, that's a good insight right there. Malcolm, looking at your question that you typed, yeah, I think one of the key things is we see the move of jobs into the professional services sector. That's actually where we are seeing the work move into all kinds of different application spaces, including things like geothermal, critical minerals, carbon storage, and all these other exercises. There's sort of, I'd argue we sort of have a dismantling of the old mental framework that we've had of the extractive industries, the environmental industry, thing like that. And so we're in that transition, but that's certainly one of the things when I've talked to individuals that have ended up going in that space, particularly the early career folks, that they really actually enjoyed is the diversity of work and including some of these cutting edge areas. So I think this is, federal employment data and their tracking does not move quickly, does not evolve quickly to capture those areas in sort of independent mode. So, but we are seeing the growth there. It's just that it sort of gets smushed into a lot of other areas. So on the Brazilian model, when do the students get paid? So yes, so the Brazilian students do get paid by the Brazilian survey. It's very much like a medical residency. It's a bare minimum sort of livable wage kind of situation for the couple years. They are also provided a bit of a housing stipend depending on where they are located. Particularly, they were saying particularly, if they're in the big cities like Rio. This has been an initiative by the government. They need the geoscientists. They have the gap, and so that money has gone in through the Brazilian survey to fund it. So basically, it's a national investment. I am sure some of that is coming from Petrobras as well, because they obviously would be a major consumer of the talent as well. And there's certainly sort of a phase across the different employers in the sector. So yes, so in that model they are paid, and it is actually the person who gave the presentation viewed it. It's a strategic decision to ensure that workforce is strong and healthy. It's considered very necessary in Brazil. So
I think that's about all we have time for. Questions. I'm going to see if we answered them all. So one comment that Malcolm also made, Chris, I'm just going to scroll back kind of to the top here, is how are university departments responding or expected to respond to this data in terms of adapting their curriculum? In my experience, the biggest lever is not at the department level, but rather at the individual professor level, who need to adapt their syllabuses and content to respond to this. And in my experience, the faculty, especially later career faculty, are resistant to this sort of change. How do we incentivize that need for change? So
yeah, I mean, that was exactly the point I was trying to make. That we've seen through the vision and change, and as the departments have been adaptable, it's the social engineering is an absolute challenge. Academia does, evolve one funeral at a time, unfortunately, in many cases. But I also think the other part of it is, as we see things like this industry apprenticeship approach. Now, if those companies, and you start identifying some of these engineering companies that are starting these things, start becoming your in-feed for students, this starts changing the entire dynamic. From an institutional standpoint. about where those priorities are. And the levers that you have against senior faculty obviously are pretty limited, but you might be able to get some institutional support and the like. So social engineering is a very, very hard thing, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think that's about all we have there in the chat. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead, and we've got a couple slides to close with. One thing, again, as part of our Grande project that we currently have out, that we would encourage you to all take a look at and maybe play, is our Natural Hazards Impact on Job Choice game. This game is designed to have people think about how hazard risk really influences career choice. And so we would invite everyone here, share this link with anyone that you may be interested. All of the details are on the game page. But again, it's a fascinating game that allows you to consider job options and hazard risk, and really take a look at how your perception of hazard risk influences how you think about job choice and location for residence choice. And I've dropped that link in the chat. And so then to wrap up, Chris, I'm going to just pass that over to you.
Absolutely. So so we will be sending out a notice about the recording of today's webinar. Should be available in the next week or so. If you have other specific questions, recommendations for future topics, please reach out to Pranoti, pasher@agu.org. And again, just another plug here for the AGI Heads and Chairs workshop, which is December 8th, 8 to 5. And as she had mentioned, there are 20 slots left. So if you're registered for AGU, please consider about signing up, and appreciate your time. And finally, next month is a community discussion. So we won't have a formal presenter, but rather come with ideas and ready to talk about supporting faculty through the tenure process. Obviously a big challenge, and this is a great opportunity to ask questions of other academic leadership, and also to share some of your best practices and experiences. So we really look forward to you participating with that.
And
So with that, appreciate it.
Yes, and again, we'll be posting the recording of today's webinar online within the week. We'll let everyone know as soon as it's posted online, along with the slides, we'll be posting those as well. So thanks everyone for joining us today.